The city was alive with secrets and whispers, a place where power was measured not by kindness but by fear, and in the heart of this city lived the Mafia boss, a man whose name alone could silence a room. His mansion, hidden behind high walls and guarded gates, was a place where luxury met danger, and every servant, visitor, and business associate knew their place. The Mafia boss walked with confidence, his sharp eyes scanning everything around him, a smile that could charm or terrify depending on his mood. People called him ruthless, clever, and unstoppable, but inside the mansion, behind the polished floors and grand chandeliers, life moved with a delicate rhythm, where one wrong step could mean disaster. Among the staff, there was one who seemed almost invisible, a black maid whose presence was quiet but always observing. She moved through the hallways with a calm and steady grace, dusting the grand furniture, arranging flowers, and cleaning every corner. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, her mind worked faster than anyone else's in the house. She noticed small details that others ignored, the way a pen was placed on a table, the way the boss frowned when he read certain letters, even the subtle shift in his expression when a visitor said something that wasn't quite right. No one thought much about the maid, yet she saw more than anyone, and that made her different. One morning, the Mafia boss sat at his grand desk, reviewing a new contract for a business deal that could expand his empire even further. He leaned back, swirling a glass of dark liquor, confident that everything was in his control, but the maid had followed the documents to the desk earlier, glancing at the papers as she arranged the room. Her sharp eyes caught something that made her pause, a clause buried in the fine print, something that could turn a profitable deal into a disaster. She studied it carefully, her heart beating faster, knowing that if this went unnoticed, it could cost the boss millions, or even his reputation in the city. The tension in the room was invisible but real, the silence heavy as she considered her next move. Speaking up could be dangerous, but staying silent could be worse. The maid took a deep breath, reminding herself that courage was often the only weapon the powerless had against the powerful. Outside, the city buzzed with activity, unaware of the storm about to unfold behind the mansion walls. Inside, the air felt thicker, charged with anticipation. The boss glanced up from his papers, his sharp eyes catching her hesitation. He was used to obedience, not caution, and certainly not warnings from someone so low in the hierarchy. Yet, she stepped forward, her voice steady but firm. "This clause is a trap," she said. Her words broke the usual rhythm of the room, echoing with weight that no one expected. The Mafia boss froze, his smile fading for a brief moment, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. He had faced threats, challenges, and betrayal before, but never from someone so quietly underestimated. The maid's eyes never left his, calm but determined, showing that she was not afraid. Around them, the servants paused, sensing the sudden tension. They had never seen the boss so visibly shaken. The mansion, usually a place of routine, now held the quiet hum of suspense. As the boss leaned closer to examine the papers again, the realization began to dawn on him: the clause could indeed ruin his carefully planned deal. It was subtle, cleverly hidden, but undeniable. The maid had seen it first, her observation sharper than anyone else's. This moment changed the dynamics of the room. The maid was no longer invisible, she had become a pivotal player in a dangerous game where one wrong move could have deadly consequences. As she stepped back, letting the boss process the warning, the weight of her action settled in. She had spoken, and the path ahead was now uncertain, but at least the danger had been noticed. In that moment, the mansion felt smaller, the walls closing in with tension, yet there was a strange calm in her stance, a quiet confidence born from understanding that knowledge and courage could be as powerful as fear and authority. The boss stared at the papers, his mind racing, the smile that usually masked his thoughts gone, and the black maid, unnoticed by most but now undeniably important, waited, knowing that the next moments would decide much more than a business deal. They would decide the fragile balance between power, intelligence, and courage in a world ruled by fear. The Mafia boss sat back in his chair, the papers trembling slightly under his hand. The words, "This clause is a trap," echoed in his mind, an accusation coming from the least likely person in the room. The black maid, quiet and unassuming, had dared to challenge him, and for a moment, the world seemed to shift. The room felt smaller, the walls closer, and the air heavier, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. Around him, the servants pretended not to notice, but the tension was impossible to ignore. The boss's sharp eyes darted to the maid, trying to read her expression, trying to find a hint of fear or hesitation, but there was none, only clarity, only someone who had studied the trap carefully, who had prepared for this moment. The Mafia boss had faced threats before, but none were so subtle, so intelligent. The trap in the contract was hidden in legal language designed to confuse, to mislead. And yet she had seen it instantly. His mind raced, piecing together the possible consequences, millions of dollars, deals with dangerous partners, the delicate balance of power in the city. Everything could collapse if the clause went unnoticed. The boss leaned forward, scanning the document again, his fingers tracing the fine lines, and slowly, the truth became undeniable. The maid had been right, and in that truth was a challenge. A reminder that even those considered weak could wield power in unexpected ways. He stood suddenly, the chair scraping against the polished floor, and the sound made everyone flinch. He moved closer to the maid, not with anger but with curiosity, his mind calculating her motives. Her calm, unbroken gaze unsettled him more than any threat ever had. "Who told you to look at this?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous, but there was more intrigue than fury in it. The maid met his stare without flinching. "No one told me, sir, I just noticed something," she said, her tone steady, as if saying anything else would have been weakness. The boss studied her carefully, recognizing a rare combination of courage and intelligence. He had always respected loyalty, but this was something different. This was bravery in its purest form, a silent statement that knowledge could outshine fear. Meanwhile, whispers began to circulate among the other servants, eyes darting nervously, some impressed, some scared. None had ever imagined that someone like her could challenge the Mafia boss without consequence. The maid, sensing the shift in power, stayed silent, letting the tension build. Her careful observation had changed the dynamics of the room, and she knew it. Outside, the city moved on unaware, but inside the mansion, the balance of authority had subtly shifted. The boss finally sat down again, the paper resting on his desk like a trap waiting to snap shut. He poured himself another drink, his mind still racing, plotting how this new information would affect his plans, but he also thought of the maid, the quiet, unassuming woman who had forced him to reconsider. There was respect in his eyes now, a dangerous respect that could be rewarding or deadly, depending on her next move. He decided to test her, to see if her courage was a fluke or a sign of true understanding. "Explain to me exactly what you saw," he demanded, his voice controlled but commanding. The maid stepped forward, pointing out the subtle loopholes, the hidden clauses, the risks that could destroy his empire if left unchecked. She spoke clearly, logically, each word measured and precise, and the boss listened, nodding occasionally, the tension easing slightly as he realized her brilliance. Other staff members tried to sneak glances, some whispering, some pretending to work, but none dared interrupt. The scene felt like a chessboard, every word, every glance, every movement calculated, and the maid had made the first strategic move. By the end of her explanation, the boss leaned back, a slow smile forming, not the confident, charming smile he always wore, but a thoughtful, slightly wary smile. He had been outmaneuvered, not by force, not by threat, but by intelligence. The realization settled in, the trap in the clause was real, and she had seen it before anyone else. The maid quietly returned to her duties, her heart still pounding, aware that she had survived the first test, and that this moment would be remembered, silently, in the mansion, as the day the invisible maid had seen what everyone else had missed. The Mafia boss sipped his drink, eyes distant, contemplating the possibilities, knowing that in a world ruled by fear, courage and intellect could be just as dangerous as bullets. And somewhere in the mansion, a quiet but undeniable power had shifted, leaving everyone wondering what would happen next. The mansion seemed quieter than usual, as if it, too, was waiting to see what would happen next. The Mafia boss sat at his desk, staring at the papers, his mind sharp and restless, every muscle in his body alert. He had faced betrayals, schemes, and traps before, but the audacity of the maid unsettled him more than any threat. He had been challenged, not by a rival or an enemy, but by someone everyone considered insignificant. The black maid moved through the room with her usual calm, dusting a vase, arranging papers, her movements deliberate and unhurried, yet her eyes were sharp, always observing, waiting for his reaction, aware that she had stirred something dangerous in the boss's mind. The tension between them was subtle but electric, a quiet duel played without weapons. His hand hovered over the papers, and he tested her. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, his voice steady but demanding. A shadow of a smile crossing his face, the maid met his gaze, unflinching, "Because I see what others do not, sir," she replied, her voice calm, "and because if this clause is signed, it could ruin everything you've built." The room held its breath, the servants pretending to be busy but listening with wide eyes. The boss leaned back, studying her, trying to read hidden motives, trying to uncover if she had been sent by someone else to sabotage him, but her expression gave nothing away, no hint of fear, no hint of deceit, just clarity and quiet confidence. For the first time in years, the Mafia boss felt a flicker of uncertainty. His usual control over the room, over people, over events, felt fragile. The maid had reminded him that power alone could not foresee everything, and intelligence, even in a quiet form, could be deadly. He decided to escalate, to push her limits and see how far her courage went. "Show me exactly where the trap is," he said, gesturing to the contract. His eyes narrowed, his mind calculating, the faintest tension tightening his jaw. The maid stepped forward, pointing to the exact line in the contract that contained the hidden danger. She explained how the words could be twisted, how a single misstep by anyone could cost him millions. She spoke logically, precisely, and without fear, every sentence revealing her sharp mind and fearless heart. The Mafia boss listened, silent, absorbing every word. The realization that she had caught what others could not made him uneasy, and strangely, intrigued. He had built an empire on fear, intimidation, and calculated risk, but here was someone who had challenged him without raising her voice or making a threat, someone who had used nothing but intellect and courage, and it unsettled him more than any gun or betrayal ever could. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, each passing second heavy with anticipation. The other servants stole glances, whispering to each other, some afraid, some impressed. None dared speak, knowing the stakes were higher than ever. The Mafia boss finally leaned back, a slow smile forming, different from his usual confident grin. This one was cautious, measured, a smile that admitted respect but hid lingering wariness. "You have guts," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Most people wouldn't dare speak up in my presence." The maid nodded slightly, her calm unbroken, understanding that words like these could carry both approval and danger. But the challenge was not over, and she knew it. The boss was intelligent, unpredictable, and dangerous. His mind was already plotting, weighing options, deciding whether she was an ally, a threat, or both. The air in the mansion was thick with unspoken questions, silent calculations, and the weight of risk. This was more than a business deal. It was a test of courage, perception, and power. The maid had made her move first, but the game was far from over. The boss leaned forward again, resting his chin on his hand, eyes piercing hers. "If you are right, things will change here," he said slowly, "and if you are wrong." His words trailed off, a subtle threat hanging in the room, but it was not angry, it was calculated. The maid held his gaze, showing no fear, aware that any hesitation could be fatal. She had stepped into a dangerous world, one ruled by fear and unpredictability, yet her intelligence had leveled the playing field. For the first time, the Mafia boss realized that courage and clarity could rival power itself. And as she returned to her duties, the unspoken duel continued, a battle of minds and wills that would shape the days to come, each of them aware that this confrontation was only the beginning, and that the mansion, the contracts, and the people within it would never feel the same again. After the maid's bold warning, the Mafia boss could not shake the thought from his mind. He stared at the contract again, tracing the lines with his finger, the words blurring as his mind raced through every possible outcome. No one had ever dared point out a mistake to him before, and certainly not someone so quietly unassuming. The clause she had highlighted was subtle, hidden in a tangle of legal phrases designed to confuse anyone who was not paying close attention, but she had seen it instantly, and that fact gnawed at him. He called his most trusted advisor into the room, a man who had worked beside him for years, handling contracts and business deals with precision. "Check this," the boss said quietly, sliding the paper across the polished desk. "See if she is right." The advisor's eyes scanned the page carefully, noting the fine print and hidden conditions. His brow furrowed, and he nodded slowly. "She is right," he admitted, the words heavy with weight. "If this goes unnoticed, it could ruin the deal, even cause losses in other connected operations." The Mafia boss leaned back, his mind processing, his usual calm replaced by a mixture of admiration and caution. A quiet respect began to form for the maid, a dangerous respect, because intelligence in someone who was underestimated was often more powerful than brute strength. He walked silently through the mansion, passing the servants who stared at him, sensing the change in his demeanor. Something about the way he moved suggested thoughtfulness, calculation, and maybe even unease. He returned to his private study and examined the clause again, line by line, cross-referencing every condition, every loophole, every potential pitfall. It was clever, extremely clever, designed to trap even the most experienced negotiators, and yet the maid had spotted it instantly. The realization unsettled him, forcing him to acknowledge her as more than a mere servant. She had a sharp mind, one capable of noticing what even his advisors might miss. For the first time, he felt the thrill of being challenged not by an enemy, but by someone who seemed powerless. He thought about the risks of showing trust, about the danger of admitting that he had been outmaneuvered by someone so unexpected. The city outside carried on with its chaos, unaware of the subtle power shift happening in the mansion. As he continued to analyze the clause, he realized the maid had done more than just spot an error. She had forced him to reconsider his strategy entirely. The contract would need to be rewritten, negotiations postponed, and partners re-evaluated, all because one quiet woman had the courage to speak. That evening, the boss called a private meeting with his inner circle, discussing the potential fallout and how to manage it without revealing any weakness. His mind remained partially on the maid, her words echoing with clarity and precision. It was rare for him to feel uncertain, yet her observation had planted a seed of doubt, forcing him to think differently. He admired her courage, though he would never admit it openly. Respect was dangerous in this world, but he could not ignore what she had done. Meanwhile, the maid continued her routine, appearing calm and obedient, unaware of the boss's internal calculations. She had delivered her warning and returned to her duties. Yet the knowledge that she had unsettled one of the most feared men in the city gave her a quiet satisfaction. In the days that followed, the Mafia boss monitored every move she made, curious about her thinking, her abilities, and whether her courage extended beyond this single act. He realized that intelligence, when combined with bravery, could shift power in unexpected ways, and that he would need to consider her presence carefully in all future dealings. The mansion, once a place of rigid hierarchy and predictable routines, now held a subtle tension, a quiet reminder that even the smallest observation could alter the course of events. And while the clause had been exposed, the real game had only begun. The Mafia boss knew that this encounter with the maid had changed the balance in his world, forcing him to acknowledge that in a realm ruled by fear, insight and courage could be just as powerful. He poured himself a drink, staring into the dark liquid, reflecting on the audacity of one quiet woman who had dared to speak. And somewhere in the mansion, the black maid moved silently, unaware of the full extent of the impact she had made, yet quietly confident that she had already won the first round in a dangerous, invisible game. The Mafia boss sat in his study long after everyone else had left. The papers from the contract spread across his desk like a battlefield map. His mind raced, replaying the moment when the maid had spoken. This clause is a trap. Her words had been simple, but their impact was anything but. They echoed in his mind, a reminder that even in a house full of loyalty, one quiet observer could disrupt everything. He poured himself another glass of dark liquor, the amber liquid catching the dim light, and took a slow sip, tasting both the sweetness and the bitter reminder of his own oversight. For a man who thrived on control, admitting that someone beneath him had seen what he had missed was an unfamiliar feeling. The boss had always believed that power, fear, and experience were enough to command respect and obedience, but the maid had proven that intelligence could rival all three. The next morning, the mansion seemed to hum with quiet tension. Servants whispered behind closed doors, exchanging glances as they speculated about what had happened in the study. Some were impressed, some afraid, but none dared ask. The boss appeared calm, but those who knew him could sense the subtle shift. His usual confident stride was tempered with thoughtfulness, and his eyes seemed sharper, scanning the room with renewed focus. The black maid moved among them as always, quiet and careful, yet aware that the balance had shifted. She had challenged the most dangerous man in the city, and the memory of that brief confrontation gave her a quiet confidence. Later that day, the Mafia boss called her into the study. The servants held their breath, waiting, knowing that anything could happen. The maid entered, bowing slightly, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her heart steady despite the tension. The boss gestured to a chair, and she hesitated for a moment before sitting. His eyes studied her intently, searching for motives, loyalty, or fear, but found none. "You have a sharp mind," he said slowly, his voice low and deliberate. "Most people would never speak up in my presence, let alone notice what you did." The maid nodded quietly. "I only saw what was obvious, sir," she replied, her tone calm but firm. Her answer pleased him more than flattery ever could. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass. "Obvious to you, yes, but hidden from everyone else," he said, almost to himself, "and that makes you interesting." His words were careful, almost cryptic, and the maid understood that in this world, every compliment carried a weight of potential danger. The boss's respect was not easily given, and now it had been earned in a single, daring act. Meanwhile, whispers continued to spread among the other staff. Some envied her, some feared her, but none could ignore the fact that she had disrupted the usual order. The Mafia boss began to subtly test her, assigning small tasks that required judgment and observation, watching her closely, assessing her reactions. Her intelligence, courage, and composure became increasingly clear, and he realized that she could become an unexpected ally, or a formidable threat, depending on her choices. Days passed, and the mansion adjusted to the new dynamic. The maid carried out her duties with the same calm efficiency, yet there was an unspoken tension, a silent acknowledgement of her new position in the house. The boss, for his part, began to involve her in minor discussions about strategy and business, testing her insights, sometimes challenging her opinions just to see how she would respond. The balance of power had subtly shifted, and everyone in the mansion could feel it. The clause in the contract had been corrected, the potential disaster averted, but the real story was now about trust, perception, and intelligence. The Mafia boss knew that in a world ruled by fear and cunning, it was rare to find someone who could observe, think, and act without being blinded by intimidation, and the Black Maid, quiet but sharp, had proven that courage could be more powerful than fear. That evening, as the mansion settled into its usual quiet, the boss sat alone in his study again, reflecting on the events of the past days. He poured another drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, and allowed himself a faint, thoughtful smile. She had taught him something important. Even in a house ruled by power and threats, insight and bravery could create ripples that no one could ignore. And somewhere in the shadows, the maid prepared for another day, ready to face whatever challenges came next, knowing that the most dangerous game in the mansion had only just begun. The days that followed the maid's warning were filled with subtle changes. The mansion, once predictable and orderly, now hummed with tension, a tension that no one could ignore. The Mafia boss moved with quiet purpose, his mind always calculating, weighing every decision, every glance, every word. He had realized that the Black Maid was no ordinary servant, and that realization unsettled him more than he expected. The staff sensed the shift as well. Their whispered conversations grew cautious, their eyes constantly flicking toward the maid, unsure whether to admire her, fear her, or resent her. The boss, meanwhile, decided to test the limits of her courage and intelligence, assigning her tasks that required judgment, observation, and discretion. He watched how she navigated challenges that others would have stumbled over. She handled each task with precision, her calm demeanor never faltering. Her quiet efficiency, combined with her intelligence, impressed him and irritated others, especially those who had long assumed that fear alone maintained order in the mansion. One afternoon, a minor incident occurred. A shipment of important documents arrived for the boss, but one envelope seemed out of place, misplaced, or perhaps intentionally altered. It contained information that could expose weaknesses in one of the boss's deals. The servants panicked quietly, unsure how to handle the situation without drawing attention, but the maid noticed the discrepancy immediately, her eyes scanning the papers, fingers tracing the edges. As she lifted the envelope and studied it, she realized the danger. It was subtle, cleverly hidden, and yet she understood it instantly. Just as before, she had spotted what no one else could. The Mafia boss had been watching from his office, observing her reaction, a faint smile forming as he saw her courage in action. Without hesitation, the maid approached him, quietly explaining what she had found. The boss listened intently, weighing every word, his sharp eyes scanning her face for any sign of doubt or miscalculation. None came, only calm certainty. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with tension. The other staff peered cautiously from behind doors and corners, sensing the gravity of the situation. The boss finally nodded, the decision made. His mind was racing, calculating how to turn this potential disaster into an advantage. He realized that this maid, this quiet observer, had become an invaluable asset. Someone who could see what others missed, and whose courage could influence outcomes in ways that brute strength never could. But with power came risk, and the boss was acutely aware that respect for her intelligence could lead to unforeseen consequences. The subtle challenge of trusting someone so low in the hierarchy was as dangerous as any enemy. That evening, the boss summoned his inner circle, discussing strategies and decisions that had been influenced by the maid's observation. He carefully refrained from revealing the source, wanting to maintain appearances and authority, yet, in his mind, he kept a close eye on her, planning how to use her talents without giving away too much control. Meanwhile, the maid continued her duties, moving through the mansion with quiet precision. Aware that the balance of power had shifted, she felt the weight of observation, knowing that every action could be interpreted, every word measured. The house was no longer just a place of routine. It had become a game of subtle influence, observation, and strategy. The Mafia boss, in private moments, reflected on the rare combination of courage, intelligence, and calm the maid possessed. He realized that in a world governed by fear, her kind of quiet strength could rival the power of guns and threats. And yet, he also knew that she would have to prove herself again, that respect in his world was always conditional, earned with every move. As the night settled over the mansion, the boss poured himself a drink, staring at the dim light reflecting off the polished floor, thinking about the invisible game unfolding within his own walls. The maid, meanwhile, paused briefly by a window, looking out at the city that knew nothing of the subtle power shifts inside. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that her actions had changed more than one life, more than one plan, and that the dangerous game in the mansion had only grown more intense, with the claws averted and her influence recognized. The stage was set for even higher stakes, testing courage, intellect, and loyalty. Each day brought new challenges, new observations, and new tensions, and the mansion, with its secrets, power struggles, and silent battles, would never be the same again. The tension in the mansion had reached a boiling point, though it remained invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. The Mafia boss paced his study, his sharp eyes scanning the contracts, the papers, the room itself, trying to anticipate every possible outcome. His mind replayed the maid's warning over and over. This clause is a trap. Her words had shaken him, but they had also sparked a dangerous curiosity. He wanted to see how far her courage and intelligence could take her, to test whether this quiet observer could truly hold her ground in a house ruled by fear. That afternoon, he called her into the study. The servants exchanged anxious glances as she entered, her steps calm and deliberate, her expression composed. The boss gestured for her to sit, his gaze piercing and calculating. "You have proven yourself observant," he said, his voice low and measured, "but I want to know how far your courage goes." The maid looked back at him without hesitation, understanding the weight of his words. "I will not fail, sir," she replied simply. Her answer earned a subtle nod from the boss, a silent acknowledgement that he was beginning to trust her intellect, yet it was also a warning that her position remained fragile. To test her further, he presented a series of scenarios, small but critical decisions that could impact the mansion, the contracts, and his alliances. Each scenario was a test of her perception, logic, and ability to act under pressure. The maid answered each one with careful thought, pointing out hidden dangers, suggesting subtle solutions, and demonstrating an understanding of strategy that surprised even the boss. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his glass, impressed and wary in equal measure. "You see things no one else does," he said quietly, almost to himself, "and that is dangerous." She nodded, realizing that in this world, respect and fear were intertwined. The tension in the room grew as he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, his eyes never leaving hers. "There is another matter," he said slowly, producing a new set of papers. "A business deal is about to collapse unless someone notices a hidden clause." The maid's heart skipped a beat, yet she remained composed. Her mind raced, scanning the pages, noting discrepancies, loopholes, and traps hidden in the legal language. As she worked, the boss watched every movement, studying her methods, her attention to detail, and her courage under pressure. Hours passed as they examined the documents together. The boss occasionally asked challenging questions, trying to find a flaw in her reasoning, but she remained steady, her logic precise and unshakable. Finally, she spoke, pointing out the exact clause that could ruin the deal, and suggested a subtle adjustment to prevent disaster. The Mafia boss leaned back, a slow, thoughtful smile forming on his face. It was different from his usual confident grin. This one carried respect, acknowledgement, and the faintest hint of approval. He realized that this maid, once invisible, had become indispensable. Her courage, intelligence, and calm composure had turned a potential disaster into an advantage. The other staff, who had been silently observing, sensed the shift in power. The Black Maid was no longer just a servant, she had become a player in the dangerous games of the mansion. Later that evening, the boss called a private meeting with his inner circle, carefully managing appearances. He discussed the corrections and adjustments without revealing the true source, yet in his mind, he kept a close eye on the maid, plotting how to use her talents while maintaining control. As the night settled over the mansion, the maid returned to her duties, aware of the subtle power she now held. She moved quietly, observing, calculating, knowing that her influence had changed the dynamics of the house forever. And the Mafia boss, in the quiet of his study, reflected on what had happened. Understanding that courage and intelligence could rival fear and authority, that even in a world ruled by violence and intimidation, a single observant mind could shift the balance of power. As he poured himself a drink and stared into the dark liquid, he allowed himself a rare moment of admiration, knowing that the danger had passed for now, but also that the games within his mansion had only just begun. And somewhere in the shadows, the Black Maid prepared for whatever challenge came next. Her quiet courage having reshaped the rules of a house where power, observation, and intelligence now intertwined. The mansion was quieter than it had been in days, yet the tension lingered, unseen but undeniable. The Mafia boss sat alone in his study, the dim light casting shadows across his sharp features. He had spent hours reviewing the contracts, double-checking the adjustments, yet his thoughts kept returning to the Black Maid, the quiet woman who had challenged him, who had seen what no one else could, and who had done so without fear. Her presence had changed the rhythm of the mansion. The staff, who once moved only to obey, now watched her with subtle curiosity and caution. They whispered among themselves, wondering what had shifted in the hierarchy. Some admired her courage, others feared it, but no one could deny that she had left a mark. The Mafia boss poured himself a glass of dark liquor and sipped slowly, his mind replaying every moment of her intervention. He had always believed that power and fear were enough to maintain control, but she had shown him something else. Intelligence, observation, and courage could rival even the strongest authority. In private, he admitted to himself that he had learned something rare, respect born from insight, not obedience. The maid, meanwhile, moved through the mansion as usual, her steps measured and calm. She had returned to her duties, yet she was aware that her role had changed. The quiet act of speaking truth to power had elevated her status in ways that no one else could measure, yet she remained cautious. Understanding that in a world ruled by fear, respect was fragile, and intelligence could be as dangerous as any weapon. Days passed, and the balance of power subtly shifted. The Mafia boss began to consult her on minor matters, testing her judgment further. Each decision, each observation, reinforced what he had already realized. She was exceptional, capable, and unafraid. The staff adapted, some grudgingly, some with admiration, understanding that she had earned a place that no one had anticipated. The mansion itself seemed to acknowledge the change. The air, once dominated by intimidation and routine, now carried a quiet tension, a reminder that one observant mind could alter everything. One evening, as the city outside roared with chaos and crime, the boss called her into his study again. This time, there was no test, no hidden trap to discover, only a private acknowledgement of her courage and insight. "You have changed something here," he said, his voice low but steady. "And that is not easily done." The maid nodded, accepting the quiet praise, knowing that acknowledgement in his world was both rare and significant. "I only did what I had to do," she replied, calm and measured. Her words were simple, yet their impact was profound. He studied her for a long moment, weighing the balance between trust and caution, respect and authority, and then, slowly, he allowed a faint, genuine smile, a rarity in a life shaped by fear and power. From that day on, the mansion operated with subtle changes. The boss was more cautious, more thoughtful, and even the staff seemed to recognize the quiet intelligence that had altered the course of events. The maid continued her work, always alert, always observing, yet carrying herself with a quiet confidence born from knowing that she had survived the unspoken tests of power, courage and intellect had proven their worth. And even in a world built on intimidation, one careful observation could shift the balance of an empire. The boss often reflected on her actions, acknowledging internally that she had reminded him that power was not just about fear, but also about understanding and foresight. And in the quiet corners of the mansion, the Black Maid moved silently, aware that her life had changed, that the respect she had earned was earned through wit, courage, and quiet bravery. She had faced the most dangerous man in the city and left a mark that no one could erase. The mansion, the contracts, and the people within it would never be the same again, and the lessons of that day would linger in the shadows, subtle but unshakable, proving that even in a world ruled by fear, insight and courage could change everything.